Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. As usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week I'm really happy to welcome onto the pod Sara Jolena Wolcott. Sara, thanks for making time for us.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. You have a great abundance and diversity of different things that you do, different hats that you wear, ecotheologian, minister, a healer, ceremonialist, consultant, advisor, singer, founder of Sequoia Samanvaya, which is an organization dedicated to harmonizing with ancient wisdom. And you also have a podcast, the ReMembering and ReEnchanting Podcast. So always happy to have other podcasters on because I'm still trying to learn how to podcast. So talking to other people who do it always is a great lesson. So really appreciate your interdisciplinary and cross-sector approach to exactly what the Forum on Religion and Ecology is about, which is kind of integrating spiritual wisdom traditions with the contemporary problems facing people and the planet. So to begin with, I always like to hear about people's kind of origin story. Like, how did you get into this? And because it's kind of a unique intersection. And I know for some people it's just like, oh, in college or something, but sometimes it goes all the way back to childhood. So how did you find yourself with this kind of spiritual sensibility? Oh, wait, you're muted.
Thank you for the question, and it's delightful to be thinking with you today. The questions of origins, I think all of us have many origins, right? We have many places where we can begin our own story, or where we can begin the story of how spirit is nudging and calling us forth.
Mm.
And for many of us, it starts long before we are born, and it is defined by our context and our times, not just our times, but the generations that come before us. And I suspect that that's very much my case, and that the more I understand the histories and the more I understand where my ancestors come from, the more I'm like, well, of course I'm doing what I'm doing now. Like, what else? Did I have a choice? Like, really? As it intersects with our time at this early stages of the Anthropocene age. So, one origin place is just being as a very small child outside of my parents' house. I grew up in California, and they were environmental activists in the local level, and then kind of in their town, and they had worked to keep the area right behind the house where we lived keep it out of real estate development. So it was a watershed land. And as a very small child, I would go out and lie on the hills. And I remember this particular moment when I would see the moon rising and hear the wolf, like a coyote in the distance. And there was an owl that kind of just passed in front of me.
Mm.
And it was that kind of early twilight. And I just knew that I not only was connected, but that the word connection's too soft and doesn't have enough tenacity to express the depth. It was like the depth of being with and in and a part of the magnificence and the beauty and the sacredness. And for me, that had a really strong gendered form. And so I felt very strong sense of like, oh, I am a part of and I am in service and my life is with her. And it was very much that lunar, earth, human, animal connectivity. And so I kind of felt that I felt just a yes respond, like that kind of, that sense of yes, you are, and yes, we are, and welcome home, and you are home. And like so many people, like I needed that home that was both close to my parents' house, but not my parents' house. And that sense of the divine parent that was both near, but also much bigger than my own human parents.
Right.
So And I think they had some similar experiences. Both my parents were, and my mother still is. My father passed several years ago, and his passing also led to this work. But they very much had a very strong sense of finding the divine in nature, and that in the wild was where you could find and you could hear the rumblings of God. They had that, and my grandparents had that, and I like to think that's been a multi-generational aspect. And then, like all of us, so I knew I was, very interested in climate change from a very early age. And then when I was, and I had a very clear call to ministry and a clear call to what we call in the Quaker tradition. I grew up in the Quaker tradition, what we call eldering. And I had a call to, particularly to ministry. I think I managed to ignore my call to eldering as much as I could. And the call to ministry in the Quaker tradition is always a bit confusing because we don't have, like, as you know, and as I'm sure many of your listeners know, Quakers don't exactly have like a formal ministerial position, right? And this is what we made the frame is that we got rid of the laity and we made everyone a minister. So everyone can have direct in relationship with the divine. And that means that there's very few like paid ministerial positions. So I got lucky and I got a lot of support from my elders, and I got to like do a lot of interning with different Quaker, like particularly with Ben Lomond Quaker Center out in California. And I went to Haverford, and I had these wonderful elders and mentors in my life and wonderful teachers. And very quickly, I ran into the work of Joanna Macy, and she kind of took me under her wing a bit. And like through Joanna Macy, I met, or I got to get to know a little bit about, Thomas Berry and Brian Swim and the great work. And that for me was really like, I remember like it was through her framework, which isn't quite the same as theirs, but like the notion of that there is a great work that we are all part of in this and the shift from the shift of telling the new story and figuring out what it means to tell the new story. And it was like, I remember as soon as I heard that said, as soon as I heard her express that, I was so struck by it. And I was like, yes, that is that my life could be a part of this great work. It was really, really compelling. So those were some early beginnings, and all sorts of things happen, and like very quickly, like, it doesn't take long before you're like, oh, but if like climate change is like influencing like everyone on earth and hurting the most vulnerable people, like why are the conferences full of white people? Doesn't take long to have that realization.
Yeah.
So like pretty early in my, and I didn't, I worked at international development, and I had a strong racial justice. I was trying to develop a strong racial justice lens in various ways, and got to work with some really amazing people in the field. And it took me all over the world, and I lived in England and worked in India and Indonesia and East Africa and climate change adaptation mitigation work. And kept on having this persistent call to ministry. And while I was in India, I realized that this thing called sustainability, which I had been learned about and taught by some of the best thinkers probably, and got to study with some phenomenal folks in the UK. And we were doing very progressive versions of sustainable development. I had co-led these international 31 country projects. And when I was living in India, it was very clear that I started listening and hearing people singing and dancing, and like, oh, this thing called sustainability is actually, it lives in the music. It lives in the dance. It lives in the culture. It lives in the ritual. And I became a singing songwriter and kind of traveled around India as a singer songwriter, and people would tell me their stories and I would sing them back to them in song. And I'm not a particularly good singer, but I have a big heart, and people could hear my heart in when I was singing to them. And that experience, and I became known as, some people started calling me Sarah Ball, which is a mystical musical tradition in India. And that experience kind of was like, okay, that's actually what, like, sustainability it isn't just the tech and the policy and the governance, which I knew was like a deeply spiritual crisis, but I hadn't kind of figured out a way in to that understanding. And then when I was singing and working with villagers, and eventually was able to work with a small environment. It was a health nonprofit, and like saw how to take their traditional worldview. In this case, had a yogic philosophy, and turn that into a monitoring and evaluation framework. I was like, oh, we can work with culture in a way that can enhance regenerative living. We can create tools, we can create rituals, we can create new stuff. We can innovate together. And from the depths of traditional cultures, from ancient traditions, we don't have to replicate like the stupid, both boring and ineffective models that is so common in development spaces. And once I started doing that, I was like hooked. Okay. And so then the opportunity like opened up to go to seminary. And that led me to do the work I'm doing now. But, so very grateful for all those days wandering with a backpack and a lot of people feeding me, a lot of dog.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and so inspiring for somebody like me who really stays primarily within an academic space. And so to see the way you're working in development spaces, in educational spaces, in religious spaces, and kind of learning how to weave all these things together, like, well, that's the work, and academics have an important part to play, but if it stays within academia, then we're not really going to accomplish much. Um, so, after telling your kind of personal origin story, I know one of the things that your work is oriented toward is origin stories more generally. And of course, this is something we learned from people like Thomas Berry and Brian Swim, is that we need to think about our cosmology, our cosmovisions. And you can't really do that without thinking about origin stories. So I wonder if you could say a little bit to that, because it's such an important point, and I think still pretty underrepresented.
It's
That
totally
Yeah,
underrepresented.
climate leadership, religious leadership, we need to be talking about this.
Right. I think so for religious scholars, I think it's kind of like a duh, like it's obvious, but we're not working with it.
Yeah.
And environmental leaders, I think environmental leaders often like forget it, because we tend to be very focused. We have a very like, our society has no attention span, right? So
Yeah.
like, what's the next thing? And so that kind of brings us not even into the present moment. It brings us into this fleeting sense of time. And it was fun. So when I was thinking about today, I like ended up going back to the universe story, and can I just like read the first paragraph?
Yeah.
I'm sure you know. And I was struck by it again. Like I haven't read it for many years, so it was really fun to go back and look at it again. And this is from Brian Swim and Thomas Berry, The Universe Story, which the FOR, the four folks, you know this. This is yours. This is your sacred text right here. Originating power brought forth a universe. All the energy that would ever exist in the entire course of time erupted as a single quantum, a singular gift, existence. If in the future stars would blaze and lizards would blink in their light, these actions would be powered by the same numinous energy that flared forth at the dawn of time. There is no place in the universe that was separate from the originating power of the universe. Each thing of the universe has its very roots in this realm. Even space-time itself was a tossing, churning, foaming out of the originating reality instant by instant. Each of the sextillion particles that foamed into existence had its root in this quantum vacuum, this originating reality. I go on to talk about the nature of time. And obviously what they're doing many things, like they're writing poetry, right? They're drawing the audience into a marriage of a sacred origin story, the religious piece, and the science, right? And then this is, of course, what both of them, and of course, what Thomas Berry is so well known for, is his deep and substantial work to bring these pieces, religion and science, coming from multiple traditions. In the language you hear Genesis, you hear in the beginning, right? You hear that kind of famous, well-known piece. And so like, and it's we keep doing this. We keep saying what happened in the beginning, because if we can go back to the beginning, we can retell the story, we can retell that origin story, then we know as humans, as mythological beings, we know that that origin story is going to shape everything that happens next, and how we frame it. The word choice that we use, was there the word, or was there sermio, or was there the conversation? What was there, the logos, or is there not the logos, right? Like, each of these word choices determines how we understand the present moment. So that's like the religious mythological. From the practical perspective, I integrate that with practice. Your how you understand the what I'm calling it, I use the word origin, but how you understand the source of a problem determines the solution to the problem. Right. So that's what that looks like in economy or science, or most of the solution-oriented problem-solving like metrics of today. You cannot, the solution, whatever your solution is, whether you're working in policy or economics, or starting a company, or whether you're starting a church, your solution, your like project, for all you project managers, is directly a result of the sense of the problem, or the whatever's going, like, what's leading to the thing that you're trying to contribute something to.
Right.
So it took me a long time to get this, but I'm going to skip over the journey that got me here. But if we tell the story, real scholars, we think a lot about origin stories in terms of each culture has this as their origin story, right? They like to look at, oh, this is the myth over here, or this is the myth over here. But we sometimes forget to spend as much attention to where is the origin story in the society in which we're living. And so democracy has an origin story. Families have origin stories. America has an origin story. Climate change has an origin story. And what I found, and for me, I started with climate change, and it happened because I was at a climate justice workshop at Union. I was at Union Theological Seminary, and some folks, and there was, wonderful climate justice leaders, including folks from the Indigenous Values Initiative and the Indian Law Alliance and Onondaga Nation. And I had worked with Indigenous communities, many different parts of the world. And so I asked a young man there the question I had asked many people. And he worked with Betty Lyons, and I said, what do you need help on? What do you need support on? And it was a casual water cooler conversation, right? In the middle of like the Bonhoeffer room. And he said, oh, we want what we always wanted. And I thought he was like, I literally had, I have finished his sentence for him. And my interpretation was that he was going to say, we want to, in the pollution in Onondaga Lake, which is one of the most polluted lakes and one of the sacred lakes in New York. We can thank Kodak Industries for the pollution of that lake. And he said, we want to rescind the doctrine of discovery. And I was just like, whoa, what is this guy talking about? And thankfully I didn't say anything silly, super stupid in that moment. But I don't remember if I looked as dumbfounded as I felt, because in my head was, what is the doctrine of discovery, which I kind of sort of knew was a bunch of papal bulls in the 1400s. What does that have to do with climate change today. Because I know, because I went to all this fancy education, I know that climate change comes from the Industrial Revolution. I know that climate change comes from carbon. I've read the science. I've seen the graphs. It's like, yeah, right, whatever. You don't know. And fortunately, at that moment, I had done enough work with marginal and vulnerable communities that I knew, like, when the tenets of good development work, when there is such a thing, it's like when people who are impacted by the problem tell you about the problem, you don't dismiss what they're telling you. Go and you figure out what's going on. So that led me down a rabbit hole. What is the relationship between climate change and the doctrine of discovery? And that led me to a lot of more rabbit holes. And I wrote my thesis on that, became my thesis topic. I was incredibly fortunate that I was at the same time, learning about the history of the civil rights movements and learning about Benjamin Mays and William Stewart Nelson and Howard Thurman and Sue Bailey Thurman. And I was also at the same time learning about some of the, preliminary and phenomenal decolonial thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire and Leopold Senghor, and of course Gandhi. And so I got to study some of these kind of really core decolonial thinkers at the same time that I was asking these questions about climate change. And at the same time that I was, eco-spirituality is easy, like that, like a no-brainer. And the way, and thinking about that interconnectivity of all beings. Okay, yeah, I got that. But what I was seeing is that, as I began to look at the doctrine of discovery, I was like, oh, the science religion problem, as Dr. James Cone liked to say, who blessed be him, and his tremendous work in Black theology, that science religious problem has a phenomenal habit throughout the centuries of ignoring what we now call liberation theology. Right. So it's I often think that horizontal axis between science and religion, which there's, that is what so much of theological thought has been about for the past couple of centuries, has ignored this more vertical axis between the relationship between God and the people who both science and religion have been harming.
Right.
And the doctrine of discovery takes us back to that initial colonial moment, leading to the enslavement of people in Africa, the destruction of indigenous America, and of course, the ecological destruction and commodification of both, and the explicit permission by the church to do so, giving the moral and subsequent economic power to what becomes the quote unquote age of discovery, or the colonial period, the first early colonial period by European powers. And I also integrate the witch hunts, the great witch hunts into that, because there was a papal bull at the same time. And I'm in conversation with a lot of folks around the best ways of framing that. But when you so then what if you reoriginate climate change into that moment in the 1400s, 1500s? A hugely dramatically thing shifts and changes.
Right.
And what changes is that climate change no longer becomes a purely scientific problem. Climate change becomes intricately and inexplicitly intertwined with race and the separation of people from place, as Willie James Jennings says. You cannot separate the two. And so, and you just, because if racism and climate change and current forms of sexism and patriarchy is much longer, obviously, and the way in which we do business is all, because that is it is an economic question, right? But if all of that, you can actually trace all of these to the earlier colonial history. And so the question of the religion that, folks like me and you are interested in is where are the values and beliefs and consciousness and attitudes that lead to climate change come from? When you originate that in the early stages of colonization, then you are forced into a conversation that interweaves most of the issues that we have today.
Yeah.
And that to me is an origin story worth telling.
Yeah. Yeah. Very well said. Yeah. And I know the Bioneers conference happened recently, and it was in Berkeley this year. And Oren Lyons gave a talk and mentioned the doctrine of discovery and mentioned how we still aren't learning this in school. And so people, can be very well educated adults. You mentioned the doctrine of discovery, and they're like, excuse me, what? And so then we still think like, well, if you want to solve climate change, just it's really just about switching to renewable energy or something. It's just a technological problem, scientific problem. It's those darn CO2 molecules. And they'd be like, actually, it's deeper. And then once you realize that climate change is kind of like another name for colonialism, then
Mm.
the work becomes so much deeper at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the things I really appreciate about your work is the decolonial emphasis, because I think a lot of people coming from a Christian background don't necessarily have that willingness to engage with the problems of colonialism and to listen to indigenous traditions. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, what it's like to open up to this kind of interreligious dialogue, working in and between different religious traditions,
Mm.
including indigenous spirituality.
Yeah. It's such a fascinating question. And it's multi-layered and it's complex and it's nuanced. I was very fortunate that I got to, coming from a Quaker background, because because within your question, there's layers, right? So coming from a largely white Protestant tradition, I was incredibly fortunate that I got to spend a fair amount of time with a Black Baptist church, a very progressive Black Baptist church in Harlem when I was at seminary. I was really lucky that the pastor was a friend of many folks at the seminary, and I got to learn from him, and he was a phenomenal pastor. And I got to see how the Spirit moved in that church, and I could feel the movement of the Spirit in that church having similarities to the movement of the Spirit in a Quaker meeting, but just like expressed vastly differently,
Mm.
like completely different. But I could tell it was the same Spirit, and I needed that to overcome some of my own prejudice about, in this case, Baptists. But like I needed to see that within Christianity and within the Black church, there is something that has sustained a people. And I say this because I had to get humble about Christianity. And I had to get humble about not, it was easy for me to be critical of Christianity. And one of my first things I had to actually understand was how much power and wonder is within Christianity and how much power and wonder is within the church. Because the histories of colonization is a history where the church doesn't look so good. The history of, and when I teach, and I do a lot, I do all this online teaching, I teach outside of academia mostly, although I am very happy and open to working with academics. It's really fun. But when I teach, I always want to ground people in a story of Jesus as a liberatory figure
Mm.
and as a man of peace, who became where a God of peace became a God of war, because so much of the history of the church as it relates to colonization is a history of using Jesus and using Christ for harm. And so I think a lot of Christians, especially white Christians, but no, I know a lot of Christians, this is not just a racial question, don't want to look at at their own complicity,
Yeah.
right? It's uncomfortable.
Yeah. To say the
Like they
least.
don't want to engage with it because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And how, and how do you how do you rectify whatever you grew up with your own spiritual experiences, your own understanding of Jesus, the ways in which Jesus and other aspects of the church, people like particular priests or pastors, how do you rectify that with these bloody, horrific, dismembering histories? That how on earth could a church, which is supposed to be extolling the body of Christ as and all of creation as part of, the love of God, how could that same church be doing these horrible, terrible, no good, very bad things? Right? And it's no use pretending it doesn't happen. And I think that's actually where people get caught in a lot of eco-spiritual conversations, is that they wanna talk about, Laudato Si. They want to talk about all the wonderful things that Pope Francis is doing. And thank you, Pope Francis. Like, I can't tell you how much that document has made my life easier. But really, for, and I have come to love aspects of Catholicism, which I never ever thought I would. That was my prejudice. But to find a way to still, you have to come to a different understanding of God, because the question that's so often missing is not whether or not any given tradition, particularly in this case Christianity, loves the environment. Like, that is not the question. The question is theodicy. Why do good people do bad things? If God so loved the world that he sacrificed his only son, why is the world still suffering? It's a question of evil, and it's a question of sin. However we understand that, and this, obviously we could go on about sin. I love talking about it, but like, how do you deal with theodicy? How do you deal with the question of evil? That's the thing that we need to be addressing. And that has economic implications, political implications, church hierarchy implications. And honestly, like, that question that's true in Buddhism, that's true in Islam, that's true in many of these traditions, because it's not like there's a global religious tradition out there that hasn't been participating in capitalism in order to advance its own, its own self, sometimes in order to survive.
Yeah.
Right? So yes, you have examples of Buddhist monks doing phenomenal things, planting trees, but you also have plenty of examples of Buddhist monasteries, quite happily, engaging with various forms of both capitalist and fossil fuel extractive tendencies.
Yeah.
And that's because that's their world, right? That's the world they're living in. It's not because they don't believe that you shouldn't be protecting life. It's because they're living in a world where they don't know what their other options are.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, so from the end of be very kind and patient and compassionate. And then how does that then intersect with Indigenous communities? Because global religious traditions are intersecting with the economy differently than Indigenous communities are. And it's a constant process of humility, of learning how much I don't know, and just some of the most extraordinary conversations, mystical experiences, and deep engagement and profound connections that have these historical implications. Because my family was very involved with the foundation of the United States, and we were very complicit and deeply formed this America. And the story that I was never told, my family's origin story never included the extent to which either the Indigenous people here, in this case, it was in Connecticut, helped us survive. Quite literally, we would not have survived without their help and support. And subsequently, how we perpetuated the genocides. Both of them were missing. Both those stories were just completely dismembered from my family history. Right. And as in my today, I have direct relationships and get to work directly with the direct descendants of the people who my ancestors both knew, learned from, and continue to perpetuate genocide on their ancestors.
Wow.
So that is a miracle.
Yeah.
And that is what this work is about. This work is about going into the hard spaces, which is where you are much more likely to create, to be able to receive and be a part of miracles that are so much more and so much bigger than otherwise possible.
Yeah. Yeah. That's,
Right.
yeah, really beautiful. And I think, I mean, I've met so many people who, when they do learn about the complicity of Christianity in colonialism and genocide and just so much war and violence, that then it's so wounding to hear that they just outright reject Christianity.
Right.
And they go, you know what? It's all going to be Eastern religions, indigenous spirituality. That's it for me. No more Christianity. And so your ability to kind of hold that tension, to not just reject the tradition, but to kind of stay with the problem, to stay with the trouble, the awkward feelings, to say the least, awkwardness. I think that's really exemplary and really laudable. And I think we need more people doing that, to, because
Oh,
otherwise, where are you going to go? There's no innocent tradition that's
there's no
just
one
the
is, and that's the
perfect,
thing,
yeah.
right? Like I was working in India before I went to seminary. Like I knew that I knew how many, like, how many both Buddhist and Hindu traditions who were eating alpha plastic. You would go into this amazing village, especially as a musician, you would go into this amazing village, and there was the people were so amazing, and the music was so amazing, and there are so many ways in which they were living a sustainable life, and then everyone would like be eating off of styrofoam plates that they would immediately dump into the local um like to the creek, because there were no garbage cans, no places to put the plates, and the tradition and the things that had enabled that village to be sustainable for hundreds and thousands of years were no longer there. And the livelihood possibilities which enabled them to be sustainable often had been missing, which is why it's so important, that I think so critical for eco-spiritual work to be very closely connected to livelihoods. Um, but so it's like I knew I knew this was not like a European Christian problem, right? And like I knew that my mm, I want to use the word dharma, that my work in the world, what I've been given has to do with my European lineage, and that has both a animist and witchy part of it, and it has a Quaker Christian part of it, and it has and it's in conversation with, and it's in dialogue with my brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, including indigenous traditions, both here on this continent in Turtle Island and overseas in other parts of the world. And I learn, and we get a chance to create new traditions and new rituals together. Like I've been able to co-create rituals with some of both my of indigenous colleagues from both North America and other parts of the world. And like we can do phenomenal creative, like that's what we do as humans, we create together, like, that's a phenomenal thing. But to get to the place where you can do that creativity, you have to, all of us have to do some form of like lifting off of like the earth is trying to spring forth this spiritual blessing into all of us right now. And we have to take off the concrete that's been filling up those springs. And all of us have to do that work. And it looks different for each of us. What that work looks like is different. But for most of us, it's some form of decolonization, and it's some form of revitalizing our sense to a non-colonial traditions in some way. And to remembering, I talk about remembering and reenchanting. And it's somatic, Thomas Berry talks so much about the narrative, and like beneath that narrative is the somatics, right? Is the remembering isn't just a re-narration. It's a somatic engagement, which is part of where the ritual comes in, is a somatic engagement to take off that concrete and lay it to a side so that the spirit and the water can both literally and figuratively flow forth. And right now, like the earth, whether you see the earth as like part of like, the Holy Father's creation, or whether you see the earth as an animate living being, whichever one you see it as, like of the many, and there's so many other options as well, that she is like flooding people with ideas and concerns and dreams and nightmares right now. And it's like, to attend to that, you have to take out some of the gunk. And that's personal work, and it's systemic work, and it's collective work, and it's within our institutions, and it's outside of our institutions. It's within higher education, it's outside of higher education. Everyone has to take out, clear that spring, and help to make it both. And there's a literal work here as well. I'm not only speaking metaphorically, but to clear off that spring and to help that flow happen again.
Yeah, that's really great. And it's such a good example of a powerful metaphor that is also very literal. That we
Yep.
do need to clear out our waterways and
Yep.
reconnect to our watersheds and get that layer of gunk and concrete off of it.
Yep.
And I think this is a big part of your work in general, is coming up with these very generative metaphors that aren't just abstract ideas, but do connect us back to our body and that somatic element and the
Mhm.
literal work of taking care of one another and the planet. Um, so one last topic along those lines. You have a wonderful newsletter, and the newsletter, the podcast. I mean, there's so many offerings, the courses you do. It's I really appreciate how many different layers of offerings you have. And but we're in the spring season now, and Easter is just about a week behind us, or I guess a few weeks by the time this airs. And so you talked about time in a recent piece. And of course, there's lots of different ways to think about time across so many traditions. But one of the things you talk about that's so relevant to spring, especially, is circular time. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, without having to just, rehearse what you already wrote in the newsletter. I'll put the links for that in the show notes. But that's another really powerful metaphor, I think, that again brings us back to our body and our somatic connection to our earth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so for all of you, whether you're a scholar or your church or your religious leader, or you are a just environmentalist or just an interested person, I can't recommend enough getting into circular time. We have courses and toolkits. Like, it's one of the most hands-on, tangible ways to enable your congregations, your students, your team, to engage and to have fun, but to connect with the cycles and to connect with wherever you physically are locally, whatever your local bioregion is, and to connect that to a liturgical cycle. And it kind of marries the ecological and the religious in this really practical way. I got into circular time when I first started Sequoia Samanvaya, and I was just out of seminary, and I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And I was doing this impossible thing, all trying to get people to pay me to talk about ecotheology and decolonization. Ever gonna do that outside of an academic context? That's a whole nother story. I've learned a lot from that in this process, but in particular, I had a couple series of mystical experiences, and through those I started first I started with the lunar cycle, drawing circular time, a circular calendar. You just draw your calendar in a circle. It's not that hard. I did it first with the lunar cycle and then with the solar cycle. And then some of my students, I kind of mentioned it to some of my students. They're like, "Oh, can you teach us how to do that?" And I was like, "Oh." So I started creating a workbook, which now it looks nice. I did it at the beginning. It was just a very long Google Doc. And so basically the idea is, Earth is circling sun. The world is always, time is a spiral. It's much more than that. It's multidimensional, it's many things. And one of the great challenges and invitations of our time is, as a friend of mine kind of put it this way, what is the liturgical calendar for a sustainable economy, a regenerative economy? And it's a phenomenally powerful question, because, in the 700s, when Europe was Christianizing, was at that point pretty Christian, the monks asked a similar question: how do we create a calendar in which and for them, the question was, which we can foretell the date of Pascala, of Easter. And that question for the sort of early European church was of critical importance. And it had been asked in several hundred years. And eventually this wonderful monk called Bede the Venerable wrote this little book called The Reckoning of Time, which kind of put previous tables together, explained why he was advocating for one particular table. But he wrote a beautiful theological, the whole thing's like, it's a theological treatise. And he starts at the beginning, like, why is time important? How is time related to God? How is time related to the earth? What's happening with the cycles of the season? How does this, he's putting it into, as C.S. Lewis would say, that big model of the universe that the medieval church and just the medieval thinkers did such a like in some ways it was very beautiful, much of their model. I have a certain admiration for it. And so the creation of the calendar was critical. And like before that moment, there had not been a comprehensive calendar that could foretell the future years. So they were naming the future, which at that point was unheard of. Like today, we use this all the time. We don't even think about it. But he was naming the future for a large amount of people and places. And so one of my kind of basic arguments in one of these articles is that that part of what it means to live in these times, the part of what it means to live in a time where time itself is transitioning, is you get to create new calendars. You almost have to, because the old calendar has stopped working, because the old story has stopped working. The old cosmovision has stopped working. And I like to think that Thomas Berry is evoking that in the story of the universe. He's inviting us to relate to time foundationally, time and space differently, and time and space are, of course, connected. Part of the problem with our current calendar system is it tends to disconnect time and place. So spring is seen like, okay, it's like, spring equinox. Well, spring equinox doesn't look like spring everywhere in the United States. Like it's this New Mexico and the Hudson Valley in New York and Boston are very, very different in what spring looks like. And spring might not be the right name for that month or that season at all. Like you might be really in a monsoon season. You might not be in a spring season with daffodils. And so it's a way in which the universal understanding of the calendar, which we can trace back to the desire for universal church, is intersecting with a local ecology, which is related to local economy and livelihoods and traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous wisdom about local ecologies in ways that are jarring, unhelpful, and can deeply serve to continue to dismember people and places from each other. So calendars kind of serve as they can sever places and people, or they can serve to bring people together. So we've been developing methodologies to help bring kind of just ordinary people closer to their place. I hope that, this is part of a much bigger initiative. There are many people who are working on revitalizing traditional ecological knowledge, and calendars is a part of that. And what we do isn't quite that, but it's a stepping stone. And so I think a lot, like, so spring is a wonderful time to be thinking about metaphors and what are the metaphors we're using, and to be thinking about time differently. And then of course the turning of the year is that's when we offer the most, that's when we make the public offerings the most. But if people are, the great thing about a circular calendar is you can engage with it any time of the year. And just to be clear, like in traditional, both Catholic and Christian thought, like time was conceptualized in a circular calendar, like the old images of Julian and Gregorian calendars, they're all circular. This linear thing, which is deep in Christianity, like the beginning of time, the end of time, the apocalypse, like it intersects with the circular time. So the seasonal calendar and the linear direction of time, like you have both of them together within Christian thought. And and Jewish, and like Judaism's a bit different. Is working with linearity time differently, but it's also there. But our modern society has almost completely forgotten the cyclical.
Yeah.
And gone almost completely into the linear. Yeah. So like that, and so that is part of the endless progress. It's part of the forever growth. It's part of the refusal to think about death. It's part of the inability to engage with a dying society or a dying narrative. So that the linearity of that time causes tremendous suffering amongst everyday people, amongst congregations, amongst students, amongst faculty, like, and the sense of that perpetual, never-ending sense of progress, becomes the dominant narrative instead of the narrative of some form, and each ecosystem does it differently, but some form of birth, life, death, and renewal, which is the ultimate, which every ecology has that. It's different. The pattern is different for different ecologies. And it's one of the most basic and profound teachings, and one of the most tangible and easy ways for people to get engaged with these much big topics.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, such a simple entry point into massive, massive topics. And
Massive.
yeah, to put it mildly. Well, geez, I mean, we just barely scratching the surface of so much to talk about. So we'll have to have you back another time because you're just doing such interesting work and have such a great perspective on things in a way that I especially appreciate how practical it is. And things like, easy to talk about how we need to reconnect a place. When you're like, well, one way to do it might be thinking about the cycles that you're part of in your watershed and thinking about the seasons and just remembering where you are and when you are. And something that simple. And then all of a sudden you could have that somatic experience like, oh, right, I'm doing the great work of our time. Uh,
Yeah,
so,
and it's like it helps to we live in a very noisy world, so our process helps people find that purpose. It helps them see where is it that God, I like to, for me the question is always, where is God leading me, so like it helps to distill, right?
yeah.
And the process that we use helps to do. And circular calendars in and of themselves, I don't think do that. But the combination of getting into the cycle, getting into understanding what's happening ecologically and personally, like putting those things together is very illuminating for people. Because most people, they want to listen, and they are hearing things, but they're often missing, like, oh, like, how do you go from the thing you're hearing to what you think your life is demanding of you,
Hmm.
right? And then how do you what does discernment look like in that process? So, we have a great need for people who can support each other in discernment in these times. It's one of our great needs. And so this tool can support that. And yeah, and a lot of the spiritual direction work I do is like, I'm thinking about this a lot. It's like, okay, so what's of all the noises, that people are hearing, within and outside of themselves, like, how are you going to um, hear the call of God within all of that, right? And that's true if you're a scholar, or if you're a religious leader, or you're just a person walking in the woods in the middle of your life. That is where you're going to stumble across some of the great challenges and some of the great teachers. And they're usually, and the animals and plants and trees next to you are part of those teachers.
Hmm. Yeah. Such a beautiful sentiment to connect to a world that's full of wisdom, brimming with teachers. Uh, well, Sarah Jolena Wolcott, this has just been a treat. Thank you so much. And thanks for reminding me that this work can be joyful and enjoyable. And it's not just the grueling effort of engaging with all the trouble. There's also a lot of promise, a lot of hope, a lot of great teachers along the way.
It's the miracle. I'm not in this for the suffering.
Yeah.
Not to shy away. It's not about, I don't want to step over it. I mean, I'm working with traumatic histories all the time, but, and we all are in some way, but we're here for the healing,
Yeah.
We're here for the love. We're not, as I say, you do not stop Easter on Friday. You go all the way through. You go into the cave and you come out of it.
Yeah.
It's like we go into the mother and we are reborn.
Beautiful. Perfect note to end on. Good. I can't imagine a higher note to end on. So thanks again, Sara Jolena Wolcott. And yeah, we'll definitely have to have you back and have more conversations.
Ah,
It's
thank you,
really,
Sam.
really a joy. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. And in the meantime, take care and be well.